Hello, everybody. Those who are present with us live for this session, and those who will be watching this later, welcome. We've got some research presentations scheduled again for today. I always look forward to these because, my goodness, you guys are doing a whole variety of fascinating topics, and you're doing them at the doctoral level, which means there's usually some substance and something to pay attention to. So we tend to move through them fairly quickly. We're looking for about a 15 minutes each, and we give feedback as we go. So if you are available, if you are watching the recording of this, you will see a feedback form for each of the presenters posted along with this recording. So you can give them feedback as well. And they'll benefit from that, the pure feedback that comes with this. So our first presenter this morning is Nichole. And Nichole, we'll turn it over to you and get us started here.
Okay, since I only have 15 minutes, I'm going to do my best to rush through this to make sure that I meet time. So, thank you guys for sitting in and allowing me to present to you today. My presentation is going to be about mission-driven human resources leading through transition while creating stability, trust during times of organizational change. And again, my name is Nichole Nichols. Can you guys see this screen? Content. Okay, great. So, just the backstory. Over the last 3 years, our university has gone through significant adjustments. For instance, our president, cabinet leadership team has gone from 9 VPs to down to 4. And we have a new president that started March of this year. And so these transitions have diminished our employee satisfaction. Our institution went from being a great place to work to feeling confused about the direction of the university with a lack of communication and clear processes. And so, with these feelings that had been led by our employees, dissatisfaction, our scores of great colleges to work floor plummeted significantly. Leadership felt that it was a continuous change of concerns for specifically employees were feeling that they were concerned of the significant turnover in leadership, the lack of trust in leadership. They felt like there was a lack of transparency surrounded about financial matters and a lack of change management discipline. And an example of how we were impacted was when the provost unexpectedly left the university during a critical campus wide strategic plan. They were heavily involved in the process in every aspect and did not really do any delegating of authorities. They were making key decisions during this time. As a result, most of his team didn't feel empowered to make decisions or continue to work without explicit direction. Meetings were canceled, deadlines were missed, and the project kind of really stalled for months until one of our strategic person came in and decided to take the project and move it forward to close it out. So over the overview of what a mission driven mindset for HR team looks like for us. So during this time, the involvement of our university's HR team became essential in maintaining stability. We knew we had to lead with courage, trust, empathy, teamwork, and respect. So, and in doing that, it had to come from a mission driven mindset. So, leadership transition in any organization can create uncertainty among the employees, and particularly in higher ed, it's our faculty and staff. What we realize in these moments, having an engaged, mission driven HR team helped us create stability. So for us, engaging this mission driven mindset really referred to the process of engaging stakeholders in decision making, fostering open communication, and promoting a shared vision that aligns with the institution mission and values. Our HR team, which is my team, played a pivotal role in fostering a mission driven mindset during this transition. We served as the bridge between our institutional values in our employee experiences. We helped articulate consistent vision. We reinforced the purpose of stability within the leadership aspects. We built trust by prioritizing transparency. We wanted to ensure that employees felt heard and valued and were able to express themselves without fear of retribution. And by aligning the HR practices with the university's core values, our team built trust through transparent communication, fair policy, and and inclusive decision making. This supportive environment allowed us to take risk and contribute ideas and to grow both personally and professionally. We were very intentional when we solicited feedback from the community. During our leadership transition, when faculty and staff expressed skepticism about the future direction of the university, the division organized listening and learning circles across the departments where every voice was valued and no concern was too small to be addressed. As we were rebuilding trust during this time, trust is built through transparency, consistency, and communication. And so our role in building trust was consistently updating faculty and staff on transition timelines, decision-making process, and providing the rationale behind why we were doing what we were doing. And this was through regular open dialogue and forums, email communication. We reinforced the transparency, wanted to make sure that our policies were applied equitably and actively inviting feedback to shape the organizational culture. I'm sorry, I went too fast. Um, the HR team during this time act as a bridge for facilitating listening sessions where employees can voice concerns and suggestions. We synthesize that feedback to inform the leadership decisions as to why we need to be very mindful and careful about the next direction of the university and what that impact would be for the employees. And so during this time, I leaned on a lot of authors, but these two in particular, Kramer and Tyler, Trust and Organization, help remind us that systems alone do not generate trust. It is the interpretation of intent behind those systems that determine how people respond. And so this suggests that HR must go beyond just the process to foster relational trust through intentional and visible advocacy for employees. I also lean very heavily on Mishra, and Spicer, their articles, their papers were truly highlighted about trust and how they're built on consistent communication and authentic leadership. And so in our HR practices, for us, this translated into transparent update on institutional directions, regular presence in employee forums, and direct communication from leadership on what could and could not be shared. And so by following these particular guidelines, these efforts helped us to reflect a leadership mindset grounded in mission, valuing people, fostering communication, and leading from a place of integrity. Even when answers were incomplete, the tone and the consistency of our communication were rooted in respect and openness. We offered a form of psychological security for staff and faculty as we navigated these changes. And so, leadership and organizational climate. HR leaders must exhibit servant leadership. And so when operating in a mission-driven mindset, leaders' primary goal must be to serve others, especially their team members, their direct reports. If we prioritize our own power or advancement, this would have employees feel unsupported. And so our team had to listen with empathy so that we could gain an understanding and awareness of what employees were experiencing and how they were feeling about things while continuing to remind and state our values of respect to departments across the campus, because when you're feeling a little disjointed, your emotions and what comes out of your mouth may not necessarily always reflect a place of respect. And so we kept wanting to push and push that forward. So, open systems and talents. So, our university has experienced um, a decline in student enrollment and rising competition. There's a lot of financial pressures that have forced us to restructure our academic offering. We've had to do some reduction in force. And with that being said, one of the issues is that our faculty was feeling the workload and feeling overworked as a result. So, working with senior leaders, trying to identify ways that we can bring in adjuncts to lighten the load, because for some, yes, they love getting the extra money for overload, but for others, they would prefer an additional body. And it wasn't necessarily about the additional pay. They wanted to truly have a work-life balance. And so a mission-driven mindset cannot succeed without deeply understanding how differences shape experiences. And so we've embedded a lot of inclusiveness into our performance appraisals in our onboarding process, not just as a checklist, the checkbox of getting something done, but we wanted to make sure that it was part of our lived values. And so we implemented performance management systems that aligned the expectation and feedback, and for our evaluations for the institutional goals. We understand that employees' performance is not just about an individual motivation, but about having clear roles, fair evaluations, timely feedback, and support systems like training and coaching. We also recognize that building a sustainable leadership bench requires processes, not just high performances. And so we worked on doing this by creating cross-functional working groups that address employees' development while simultaneously addressing the institution accreditation goals. So HR craft during transitions, developing HR knowledge on mission-driven practices. So it was essential for us to incorporate sessions for hiring managers to understand our institution mission in practical terms. Unfortunately, our community did not feel that our mission statement captured the heart of what we do. And so we had to transition our conversations around questions such as, what does a mission driven employee look like? How does a hiring practice reflect our values of diversity, engagement, of service? And so from this approach, we are working together to develop shared language and a clear understanding of how mission translates into competencies, behaviors, and job descriptions. So, to enhance our communication across campus and to ensure that everyone is heard, the cabinet meets with every governance group for the first 10 to 15 minutes of each of their meetings, so that any questions or burning questions that are out there or misunderstandings, allow us that time to basically clear the air and to make sure that that the employees are getting the information during real time, and cabinet and leadership really understand what's going on. And so, but still, unanswered questions still remain for the HR team specifically. For us, it's like, how do we maintain respect when when the university's decision contradict the employees' values? How can HR challenge leadership while maintaining institutional loyalty? And what happens when HR itself is caught between advocacy and enforcement? Character formation in HR. So, HR serves as a moral compass in times of organizational change by grounding decision in ethical principles, institutional values, and a commitment to human dignity. When uncertainty arises during layoffs and leadership transition, restructuring, or cultural shifts, we were uniquely positioned to balance business needs with the well being of the employees. So, HR ensures that our policy and procedures and decisions are applied consistently and equitably, regardless of the position that an employee has. As we were guiding our leadership team through layoff, we wanted to make sure that we were transparent through this process and wanted to ensure that we were very clear about what the managers could and could not do. So during the reduction in force, we ensured that decisions were based on objective criterias, um, such as job relevancy and performances, and not based upon favoritism, discrimination, or retaliation. We reminded our leadership team of the university's values and ensuring that the changes reflected our financial goals, not only our financial goals, but human-centered priorities like respect and service, inclusion, and integrity. And in times of this, and during this time, HR became more than just an administrative function. We were like the moral center of the institution. We held space for ethics, empathy, and equity. We ensured that what is done um, is not only effective but right. We reminded our leadership team and our employees how to treat people in hard times. And how we do things defines the integrity of the university going forward. So mission as learning and reflection. HR conducts listening campaigns, which includes anonymous surveys to all employees, focus groups for faculty, staff, and supervisors. We do one-on-one interviews with department chairs and deans and follow-up feedbacks for continuous improvement. As a reflective partner, HR examines the past to inform the future by leading comprehensive exit interviews, engagement survey results, and employee grievances over the last 3 years. And so by doing this, this analysis reveals consistent themes. We realize that, yes, there is a lack of communication, leadership inconsistency, and the feelings of disconnection amongst the university. So instead of ignoring the past, we use it to surface hard truths, helping leadership understand the causes of cultural dissatisfaction. And so our mission as a vocation for us, for the HR team, is that our department doesn't view our role as merely enforcing policy or managing benefits. We see our work as a calling to serve people, uphold dignity, and create a workplace rooted in justice and respect and a shared purpose. And so this sense of vocation is lived out daily through intentional actions grounded in advocacy, equity, and service. We advocate for employees. Um, the employee votes by hosting the listening and learning sessions, creating safe spaces where they can be heard without concerns or fear of retaliation, and ensuring that leadership receives de-identified feedback and responses that with visible action plans. And so employees who previously felt unheard now see HR as a trusted voice that represent their concerns with integrity and courage. HR leads a comprehensive pay equity audit, and we review to make sure that people are paid equitably based upon their job descriptions during times of hardship or illnesses. We want to make sure that employees have flexible work schedules where they don't have to choose between a paycheck and taking care of their loved ones. And we basically have become known as the heart of the institution, where people are treated not as a position, but as a whole human being. And at the center of this mission-driven approach is live values of respect, which shapes the character of our team and the employees we serve. And so we demonstrate that by listening deeply without judgment, valuing the diverse perspective, treating even difficult conversations with dignity, rather terminating an employee or resolving um, a conflict. And so we even looked at language barriers, and trying to ensure that we provide the right material so that an employee can interpret the information based upon where they are within their space. And so finally, in closing, human resources plays a vital mission-driven role in shaping the university's culture by serving as both a bridge and a builder, uh, bridging gaps between leadership and employees, and building systems rooted in fairness, dignity, and shared purposes. And so in times of change, we become a steady presence helping foster truth through transparency, advocacy, and consistency. And so through learning, through listening, inclusive practices, and thoughtful leadership, we cultivate a workplace where all voices matter and where community is not just a concept, but a lived experience. And so through these experiences, I personally learned that HR is far more than just a support function. It is a mission driven force that can heal, unite, and lead. And so I've seen firsthand how listening with empathy and acting with integrity basically creates a built trust that fosters a genuine sense of community here. And this process has deepened my understanding of what the responsibility of an HR professional really is. And it's not only to serve, but to advocate, but to uplift and transform the institution that we're a part of. And so, with that, I am done.
Thank you, Nicole. I had a few compliments for your spirit about this and the feedback form on the other side. So
Thank you. Oh, let me stop
yeah,
sharing. I'm sorry.
and we'll invite William to go ahead and load yours, and I'll go grab your form.
Unmute. Okay.
Uh,
All right, I will set my timer and I'm going to hide behind my presentation and see if I can get this shared properly. Hopefully, start from the beginning. How is this looking?
We're not seeing anything yet. And by the way, while you're doing this, if Doctors Keim and Redden, you're welcome to stay to hear the other presentations. I know you're here for Nicole. If you disappear at this point, you will not be offending any of us. But thank you for your
Okay.
engagement
Share.
there.
Okay, how about now?
We can, yes.
Okay, let me make sure that this starts from the beginning. Okay. How's this?
Yeah, we're not seeing the presentation version. We're seeing your presenter view.
Oh, I think I know. Yeah, let me try this again. Sorry for the delay.
Nah, that's why we give a couple minutes in between presentations here to get things set up.
I
And I
was
just heard from Jermaine, he will not be joining us, and we still haven't seen Edward, so we may have a little more we may be a little more generous with these transitions here today than we sometimes are able to be. I think you did it. That looks great.
okay. How about that?
All good.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And this is really a part two uh, of my first presentation from several months ago, where I waxed more philosophical with respect to metaphysical realism and sacramental ontology. My overall thesis in this program is one in which I attempt to offer a realist metaphysic for this artificial age. Sacramentality, personhood, and the mission of God. There is a deep identity crisis of modern culture, and I believe it involves identity with respect to personhood. However, today this is what I'm calling a preliminary unscientific prelude in which we try to navigate this artificial age. And I do lean a lot on Hans Boersma in his sacramental ontology. In fact, he personally found my third faculty mentor. I emailed him and said, hey, I was wondering if you might be a guy who knows a guy. And sure enough, he did. And so that turned out super. But what I mean by artificial age, it falls in line with what he talks about, his critique of modernity and postmodernity. He says it's predicated on the abandonment of a pre-modern sacramental mindset in which the realities of this worldly existence pointed to a greater eternal realities in which they sacramentally shared. He says once we did that, we unmoored our understanding of creation and ourselves from their origins in God, and that's where we are today. For me, what makes this age artificial lies not just in the abandonment of this participatory or sacramental realism, but in the attempt to replace it with something else that is unreal. For instance, we've reached a point where not only is there a perceived no need of the God hypothesis, but culturally, the God hypothesis cannot even be considered in many cases by statute, or at least in polite society. Ideas of God, the very ground of being, of whom, if true, I mean, what else could be more true than God, yet cannot be included as a conversation partner in discussions of life's big questions in, say, public education curriculum, scientific method generally, courtroom decisions. The God hypothesis has been replaced by the not God program, even if in theory there might be a God after all. As well, the whole of reality is being defined artificially. Now, let me say, my goals are not legislative or political. I'm simply interacting with the current cultural climate. My agenda is charismatic, didactic, and ecumenical. My concerns are evangelism, discipleship, and that the body of Christ may all be one. Shannon Valor, the AI Mirror, How to Reclaim Our Humanity in an Age of Machine Thinking. This is a secular text. I do want to read this entire quote because I'm going to interact with it a little bit here. She says, it has always been and will always be a struggle to know what and who we are. We ask the question of what it means to be human again and again without ever hearing a definitive answer. That's because to be human is to have to answer that question yourself and then do it again over and over with every choice that you make or unmake. Well, my question is, why? To be chimpanzees or bonobos is simply to be either one, even when they're not thinking about it. And asking that question over and over, it may be a stimulating exercise of the sovereign self, but it's impossible to go beyond the goldfish that insists that it travels the world every day. And for those of us who prefer the pursuit and communal peer-reviewed research and reflection, quote, without ever getting a definitive answer, our projects ultimately will never be anything more than an acknowledgement that the hominids are thinking again. But what if I can hear a definitive answer to the question as to what it means to be human? What if there is a word, a logos, who speaks the answer? Ultimately, valor proceeds from what I perceive as a false premise. I submit that it is not true, that it has always been and will always be a struggle to know what and who we are. There was a time, evidenced in late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, and even prior to both, when we did know what and who we are. So my ultimate thesis, as I said, is that the recovery of a realist metaphysic will empower Christian witness specifically for this artificial age, namely with respect to personhood. So let me say, in classical Christian notions of personhood, they center on the image of God and its restoration in the incarnation of Christ. In short, the most severely intellectually disabled and nonverbal human bears the image of God, whereas the apes at the zoo, showing off their sign language skills, do not. And the artificial superintelligences, even if the courts one day, grant them legal sentience, cannot. So my goal, as I said with this presentation, though, is just to briefly help us navigate this artificial age. There's certainly no shortage of monikers to timestamp our current age. Modernity, late modernity, post-modernity, post-postmodernity. It just goes on and on. Here are several attempts to diagnose this current age. And not all these texts are written from a Christian or even faith perspective. There's concern in the secular world as well. Charles Taylor, he says the secular age is not so much about rationalism and materialism, but that belief in God is one choice among many, even in the mind of believers, where one can give up faith yet mourn its loss. Joseph Bottom, in An Anxious Age, he says our moral sense of ourselves, or whether or not we are good people, or whether or not we are saved, manifests in a spiritual age when the political has been transformed into the soteriological, when how we vote is how our souls are saved. Uh, Consider the vocabulary of righteousness and evil we find in political discourse these days. Yet Zygmunt Bauman, talking about living in an age of uncertainty, says what unites modern forms of life is precisely their fragility, temporariness, vulnerability, and inclination to constant change. Gene Twenge, this is the last one here, talks about why today's young Americans are more confident, assertive, entitled, and more miserable than ever before. And it's this, I believe it's this tug and pull of our self-sovereign instability that contributes to our identity crisis and insecure sense of personhood. Uh, Attempts to identify the person, transhumanist, post-humanist. We've got AI and the future of personhood. Here's a Time magazine article. AI human romances are flourishing, and this is just the beginning. Beyond personhood, an essay in trans philosophy. And as we know, these are not fringe ideas. These are conversations that are out there. You may have to dust off your freshman intro to philosophy textbook, but the nominalist critique of the so-called problem of universals has created today what I call the problem of particulars. The particular now gets to define itself. This text here, Talia May Betcher is a transgendered philosophy professor out of Los Angeles. And this brand new text, 2025, Beyond Personhood, an essay in trans philosophies, the philosophical innovations required to defend my view are by no means inconsequential. Well, we're in agreement with that, as I propose abandoning the notions of person, self, and subject. Now, these can be uncomfortable conversations because of not only the human element involved and so many personal stakes and outcomes, but because in today's climate, the church's attempt to have something to say about controversial social matters we know does not carry the clout that it used to. Aaron Renn, in his Negative World, talks about how society has an overall negative view of Christianity. The new morality is not, we need to understand this, is not seen as bold-faced immorality by those who support it. As Brad Gregory notes, in contemporary Western societies, religious beliefs and practices are optional, moral beliefs and practices are not. So in order for the new morality to be moral, the old morality, that is traditional Christian teaching, has to become the new immorality and is increasingly seen as such. How did we get there? Where does this come from? Just going to defer to Charles Taylor, A Secular Age. He contrasts the pre-modern porous self, where we were influenced by outside influences, the principalities and powers, spirits, angels, demons, saints, God, prayer, sacraments, thin times, thin places, as opposed to the modern buffered self, in which a new sense of the self and its place in the cosmos was not open and porous and vulnerable to a world of spirits and powers, but buffered. This space within is constituted by the possibility of introspective self-awareness. Well, my question is, what about the possibility of introspective self-deception? Barna Report, predominant worldview today. They say it's syncretism. They have 7 major worldviews, And what they found is these different groups, 89% of millennials, 86% of Gen Xers, 83% of boomers, and 86% of builders are syncretists. They could not even find a stat to show that even 1 in 10 was dominated by any one of these 7. And American pastors, they say 62% have a predominantly syncretistic worldview. The religious landscape, we know about this. We know about the growth of the nones, the atheists, the agnostics, and the nothings in particular. Non-verts who used to be something and are not now. So we have the ex-evangelicals. We've got secular spiritualities, the re-enchantment of the world, secular magic in a rational age, giving up God, resurrecting a spirituality of love and wonder, political spiritualities. It goes on and on. As I wrap this up, I want to highlight, this is an interesting text, The Secret Despair of the Secular Left. Anna Levy-Lyons, again, this is 2025 text. She has no right-wing axe to grind. She spent 16 years as a Unitarian Universalist minister. She's currently in rabbinical studies. But she talks about common religious reactions to cultural conflict in which traditional religion crashes in that conflict, and talks about the 1-2-3 crash model of Rabbi B'nai Lap. What do? 1, we can deny the crash, revert to the master story, and try to shore it up to prevent more threatening information from getting in. Number 2, we accept the crash, decide that our master story is rotten to the core, throw it out entirely, and write a new master story, hence your ex-evangelicals. Or we accept the crash, keep the master story, using the crash to understand the master story, possibly revise it and tell it differently. And creatively, what do we not do? I say we do not build a high wall and hold on to the old paradigm. We do not have a reactionary clinging to tradition, because the Christian gospel is not about cherished lifeways in various versions of traditionalism. It is about how the time of ignorance got overlooked, but now he commands all people everywhere to repent, because he has fixed a day on which he will judge the world in righteousness by a man whom he has appointed, and of this he has given assurance to all by raising him from the dead. We navigate this artificial age with the conviction that the Easter story is real, that once in the history of the universe, a dead man came back to life, never to die again. And this is an astounding claim. More astounding if it's actually true, and it changes everything. And as Paul Kingsnorth reflects, he says, did God intervene on earth just to give us another identity to fight over? Or did he tell us to live differently, to see differently, literally to repent? Does not mean say you're sorry, metanoia, but rather transform yourself, turn around, change your mind, change your heart, change your way of seeing. So finally, my proposal for the 1-2-3 crash model is 4. We accept the crash and acknowledge that our culpability in that crash stems from our own chipping away at the coherence of the master story, and that we must return to the worldview in which it was first revealed. We, the church, need to recover a realist metaphysic for this artificial age, and that will be developed in the future. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, sir. You have no passion on this whatsoever. That was wonderful. I was too busy typing to get back here in time to engage in that. I would love to have a long conversation, because you're talking about a lot of the stuff that's fascinating me these days, and we will do that in the notes and in some other context. But thank you for that. Appreciate that, William. Awesome. Renee's getting set up already, and let me pull out the feedback form and share that. Okay. That's shared, and I see a screen. Are you good to go?
I think I am if everyone else is all set.
I love the fact that these are three very, very different presentations here, or at least the
Very
topics are.
different.
I'm looking at this title going, okay, we're in new territory here again. This is lovely. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. My name is Renee. I'm also completing the Imagining Mission course through this process. My final work, my dissertation, will be in biblical studies, particularly in the Old Testament. And so for this course, I chose to research the missional character of divine election in the Old Testament. And so today I have to share with you just a review of my lit review, kind of those takeaways, and then a case study on the election of Jacob in Genesis 25 and 27. Just to let you know kind of the background of why I chose this topic and kind of how I've proceeded, which will come through in my presentation as well today. I began in the literature review by examining the question, how does the Old Testament theologically articulate and reinforce the mission of God? And this question came from what on the surface level can seem like a disparity or a discontinuity between the mission of Israel and the mission of the church because of the obvious, right? The church has been sent. This is what we're told in Matthew 28. They're sent to the nations, and yet Israel was not sent to the nations. However, we know that God's mission has not changed from the beginning, especially from the fall. His mission to redeem the world has stayed the same. And so his people, if they are on his mission, must all be missional. And so I sought to explore how the Old Testament is articulating that, how they're reinforcing the mission of God through God's chosen people. And then a narrower topic kind of came to the surface as I began, and that is, what role does election play in advancing God's mission? My thesis for my literature review was that there is complete continuity between the mission of Israel and the mission of the church, and that election is in fact a primary means by which God carries out his mission across the canon. All of this research and what came to the surface, then I took and I applied that then in a case study to find how a missional hermeneutic, so a missional reading, how that impacts the interpretation of the election of Jacob in Genesis 25 and 27. Down the road, I intend to do the bulk of my work in the patriarchs, maybe even in the Jacob narratives. And so beginning to kind of dip my toe into that space, even through this work. So I'll begin with a brief review of my research on both the mission in the Old Testament and election as an instrument of mission in the Old Testament. In his book, The Mission of God, Christopher Wright argues that the entirety of Scripture is actually organized around the principle of mission. Whereas scholars that have come before him, who have been dedicated to researching mission in the Old Testament, have kind of approached it as a going and looking for where mission shows up. Christopher Wright argues that actually we should be holding mission out as the primary lens through which we see Scripture. To quote him, this is because, in short, a missional hermeneutic proceeds from the assumption that the whole Bible renders to us the story of God's mission through God's people in their engagement with God's world for the sake of the whole of God's creation. So, for instance, if we look at the call of Abraham happens on the backdrop of universal sin and rebellion and need. God sees the universal need of all people, and his response is to call Abraham. So this frames the mission then of Abraham and his descendants that will follow according to the purposes of God to redeem the nations. For Wright, a missional hermeneutic requires that we read every part of the Bible in light of God's mission. If Yahweh alone is the one true living God, he says, who made himself known in Israel and who wills to be known to the ends of the earth, then our mission can contemplate no other goal, and by extension, neither could the mission of God's people, Israel. So this is the kind of overarching missional hermeneutic that I found rising to the surface as I read other scholars as well. Although Israel was never instructed to go out and actively engage with other nations for the purpose of making God known the way that the church is, they are specifically instructed to live out a type of devotion to Yahweh that is necessary for anyone who would pursue such an outward-facing work still. However, as H.H. Rowley summarizes, Israel's missional task then was loyalty to Yahweh first and foremost. This idea is built upon by Charles Tabor, who takes Israel's missional task and the missional task of the church and gives a helpful structure to it, in which he summarizes the Old Testament, God's missional activity in the Old Testament as centripetal, meaning that it pulls others in to see God through Israel, whereas in the New Testament it is centrifugal, sending the church out to the nations. These are differing modalities, but they serve the same central mission of God and are therefore both missional. So what did Israel know of their missional responsibility? How did they understand that? Knowledge of that mission is demonstrated by the words of the psalmists and the prophets. For instance, the prophets who wrote about the coming of the nations like a river to worship Yahweh understood that Israel's efforts toward loyalty and faith were participating in this ultimate future goal in God's mission. We also know that when God called the people out of Egypt and formed them to be his own, he gave them the role of a kingdom of priests. And a priestly role is a mediatory role. Priests serve God, and they also serve before God on behalf of others. And so Israel's service to God is framed then as being for the benefit of God's relationship with the rest of the world. This type of framing means that they would have had to know that their relationship to Yahweh was never intended to be entirely inward facing solely for their own benefit, but they would have known that it was for a missional purpose, for mediating the knowledge of God to the nations. So here we move more specifically into the more narrow topic of election as an instrument of mission. And actually, I think I missed something. Let me go back to my notes. Oh yes, I wanted to add that the way that I got to this topic of election specifically was that in Wright's own work, Christopher Wright, he spends a third of his time in the interpretation of the biblical narratives of the people of God. He considers the roles of election, redemption, covenant, and ethics as primary theological means through which God advances his mission. And so I chose to continue my work with the theme of election. I wanted to capitalize on the opportunity to bring a broader biblical understanding to a topic that for the most part remains soteriological in our discussions. So I wanted to kind of drill down on that from an Old Testament perspective. So our modern discussions on both mission and election often begin and end in a New Testament context. But election is the way that God chooses to carry out his mission throughout the Old Testament as well. Therefore, examining election in the Old Testament is necessary for developing a fully biblical understanding of election, even for the New Testament church. Historically, election is often interpreted through a lens of favor and prestige. And to be sure, God calls his people his treasured possession in Exodus, and he gives them his favor, his blessing. He promises them those things. However, if this is the primary lens through which we read God's election, what we end up with is an individualistic and exclusionary election that actually costs very little to those who are elect. But that is not the reality of divine election in the Old Testament. And so instead, a missional hermeneutic puts service to God's mission at the forefront and leans away from the emphasis being on favor and prestige. Since God's mission is universal and people are elected as an instrument for this universal mission, this means that election of one person or people does not actually imply the rejection of the other person or the other peoples. On the contrary, election is for the ultimate inclusion of the other peoples. Throughout the Old Testament, God's election does not determine who is in at the exclusion of those who are out, but instead divine election is in service of God's mission to bring those who are on the outside to the inside. Rather than being a sign that God has rejected the other nations, the election of Israel is God's action that demonstrates his intention to bring all nations in. An election then throughout the Old Testament is always instrumental rather than inward facing, because in the Old Testament, divine election is missional and not soteriological. Once we establish that the purpose of divine election is for service of God's mission, when we are dealing in a missional hermeneutic, then I took some time to examine the nature of the state of being elect, both the expectations of the elect and the relationship of God to his elect. For the sake of time today, I'll just share these summary statements with you of the information that I brought together. And that is that regarding the expectations of the elect, across the Old Testament, those who are elect are expected to actively engage in relationship with God, which may sound like an obvious statement, but here what we have is a confirmation that the mission of the people of God throughout the Old Testament was active. It was participatory. Even if it didn't look the same, it wasn't the exact same modality as the church in the New Testament. It was not stative, it was not static, but they were called into something very active. Second, related to God's relationship to his elect, God is committed to the ones that he elects. His mission doesn't override his commitment to them. And that is a bit of a balancing statement. When I spent so much time reading about and writing about and thinking about this mission first, mission first, mission first, it begins to feel sometimes like, gosh, doesn't he care about them at all? Is this really just all about his mission? But in reality, his relationship to his elect is just as strong. He is as committed to them as he is to his mission, because in his own way, in his own, only his way, he can hold both of those things together. So finally, then, I got to apply these characteristics of missional election to the reading of the election of Jacob in the narratives in Genesis 25 and 27, which primarily led to a shift in focus of how we read them. So typically the rivalry of Jacob and Esau is read with an assumption that the election of one means the rejection of the other. But when we read the narrative with a missional hermeneutic, keeping the mission of God as the primary message, the biggest shift is that there is not actually a rejection of Esau. It may feel a bit redundant, but I think it's worth reading through these outcomes that I have on the slide for you, because as we kind of feel that redundancy happen, sometimes it brings some clarity to what's really going on when we apply this missional hermeneutic. So let me just highlight for you what I have here. First, that when we read the election of Jacob through a missional hermeneutic, the purpose of his election becomes Jacob is elected to service of the mission for the sake of the world, including Esau. So the purpose of Jacob's election becomes for the other, and the other in the story of the rivalry between Jacob and Esau is Esau. Next, the focus of his election, Jacob is then God's instrument. What the purpose of his election is for the world, and then the focus of where that service is for is also then for the world. Jacob is God's instrument to bring redemption to the world, including Esau. The outcome of Jacob's election is to be the inclusion of the world. This is where God is heading. This is his work, and that includes Esau. I mean, I think you can see how ridiculous it begins to sound, but let's keep going. The benefit of Jacob's election, then, his benefit is it's not for him, it's not to raise him up, it's not to give him safety, it's not to make him special, although some of those things happen, but the benefit is for all nations. It is to include Esau. And finally, the cost of Jacob's election. If it is all about him and his family and the prestige, then it is minimal. He is receiving more than he is giving, but the real cost of election really comes with suffering as we serve for God's mission. And we see that from the very start in Jacob's narrative, as he immediately has to flee the land where he is supposed to be as the bearer of God's promise, and already is experiencing suffering as the elect. So in summary, Jacob's election isn't for Jacob. It's for Esau and the rest of the world. Esau isn't rejected. God is on mission to bring Esau's descendants to redemption, and Jacob is the one who is called to higher accountability and suffering in order to serve God's mission. These passages are all biblical evidence for God's mission that extends to Esau or to Edom. These are Esau's descendants. We can read in various places. I won't read each one of these to you, but where we see God call out Edom specifically, both symbolically and specifically, as who he is including and who he's calling to himself, as well as his expressions of calling all the ends of the earth. Even in Zechariah, where he is predicting that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem, which is Edom at one point, that they will be called into worship. So as all the world is brought in, this includes all the world, including Esau and Edom. I do want to, though, acknowledge and deal with this sneaky little verse that may already be popping into your heads when we think of Jacob and Esau, and one being chosen and one not being chosen. We may immediately go to Malachi 1, where we have these somewhat famous words, "Yet I have loved Jacob, but I have hated Esau," or "Yet Jacob I loved and Esau I hated." Is this not proof that God is actually rejecting Esau in that moment when he's choosing Jacob? And what I want to say is that no, it's not actually proof. When you examine what's going on in Malachi, what we have is rhetoric happening here. God is actually confronting Israel, the nation, who claims that he has not loved them and has not cared for them. And he's doing that with rhetoric. He's using the names of Jacob and Esau to stand for the nations of Judah and Edom. And at this point in history, Edom has now become an enemy of Judah after attacking Jerusalem when they were at war with the northern kingdom. And so God has promised to avenge Judah against Edom. And this is an evidence then of God's commitment to the ones that he elected. So basically what it boils down to is that even though Jacob and Esau's names show up in this verse, this is not a verse about the election of Jacob. This is a verse about God's commitment to those whom he has elected and the promises that he has made to them. So what are the implications of missional election? Well, understanding election as missional rather than soteriological throughout the Old Testament has some important potential implications. First, it reframes divine election in the Old Testament. There are individuals who are elect throughout Scripture, throughout the Old Testament, and the elect are chosen then for service to God's universal mission. This is a new way of looking at it. For instance, in the Jacob and Esau narratives, it pulls us away from asking questions like, well, why one and not the other? Why Jacob? Did he do something right? Did he do something wrong? Did Esau do something wrong to have something taken away from him? But when we are looking at God's universal mission and the fact that there actually is no rejection happening there, then those questions don't really make sense anymore. And instead, we're focused on what God's doing, and we're focused on his bigger picture. Also, there then becomes no exclusivism. Election in the Old Testament does not necessitate the rejection of the other. And its purpose is not to create an exclusive group, but to create a way to bring the outsider in. Now, a huge limitation of what I've brought here today is that I haven't bridged this to the New Testament for you, to what it means for the church. But I do think that there is a lot of value to us in making sure that we have imported what God is doing through those that he elects throughout the Old Testament into even the new modality that exists in the New Testament. And that is maybe like a next step of work that I may be interested in doing from there if I was to keep moving with this research. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Renee. It looks like there's only the 3 presentations today, but wow. I've been arguing for years now, and all of you have probably heard me made this argument before, that anthropology in one form or another is the key discipline of our era. William, you were arguing this pretty strongly, maybe not in those words, but when we lose what it is to be human, then we also lose what it means to be, we also lose God. Maybe it's vice versa, we lose God. But anyway, all three of you were hitting this question of what it means to be more fully human, to be seen, chosen, elected, and chosen by God, to have a sacramental understanding of our humanity in the presence of God. Nichole, to treat human beings, to serve them as servant leaders in the midst of the transitions and not merely as resources to be. That's one of the comments I made. Maybe I deleted that one anyway. Maybe we need a new phrase other than human resources, because humans are not just resources, and they're not just instruments that are to be used or exploited or abused. That there is something of the dignity of our nature as created beings in the image and likeness of God and co-creators in the universe. That requires a more robust anthropology than our mechanistic artificial world has been offering us. And in very different ways, I think all three of you are trying to recover that. And I love that spirit. I love that intent. And there's work to be done yet, and probably work to be done on each of your individual projects, but way to go, in at least in terms of where you're headed with it. And I just wanted to compliment all three of you on that. So thanks for the presentations. We'll stop the recording and post these here in a little bit.